All right, today we are cracking open one of my favorite cosmic case files, one a lot of us grew up with. What in the world happened to the ninth planet? Pluto. So let's follow the clues and see how this single decision completely redrew our map of the solar system. For most of our lives, the solar system had 9 planets. It was just a fact, like the sky is blue. Then in 2006, it felt like astronomers just changed their minds. So, what did they find that made them go back and rewrite all the textbooks? Let's dig in. Look, this isn't just a simple story about demoting a planet. You gotta think of it more like a detective story. We're gonna follow the evidence that scientists gathered over decades, clues that led to a verdict that, believe it or not, is still being argued about today. Okay, so every good detective story has a set of rules, right? Well, for Pluto, the whole case hinged on this official 3-part definition of what a planet even is. The International Astronomical Union laid it out in 2006. An object has to pass all 3 of these tests to earn the title. And this is where it gets really interesting. Does Pluto orbit the sun? Yup, check. Is it round? You bet, check. But that third rule, that it has to have cleared its neighborhood, well, that's the one that threw a wrench in everything. And to really get what that means, we need to rewind all the way back to when Pluto was first discovered. Before we can even start talking about Pluto's crowded neighborhood, we have to understand why, for most of the 20th century, everybody thought it was completely alone, just this last, lonely outpost at the very edge of everything we knew. The whole search began because astronomers were basically hunting a ghost. They were convinced some huge planet X was out there gravitationally messing with the orbits of Uranus and Neptune. So in 1930, a young astronomer named Clyde Tombaugh was doing this incredibly tedious work, comparing photos of the night sky when he finally saw it, a tiny little dot that had moved. It wasn't the giant planet they were looking for, but it was something new. It was Pluto. What's so wild is just how long Pluto held on to its secrets. For decades, it was literally nothing more than a speck of light. It took us 20 years just to figure out its color, and almost half a century before we realized it even had a moon. It was basically the solar system's ultimate cold case. But then, in the 1970s, everything started to change. This is really when the first serious cracks began to show in the case for Pluto being just another planet. That simple picture of a lonely rock, it was about to get a whole lot more complicated. So the first big clue was this really weird shape. Back in 1978, astronomers looking at photos of Pluto noticed it wasn't perfectly round. It looked kind of lopsided, almost like it had this giant bump growing out of its side. And that bump? Well, it turned out to be a moon, which they named Charon. But this was no ordinary moon. Charon is about half the size of Pluto itself. I mean, nothing else in our solar system has a moon that big compared to its planet. It was the first real sign that Pluto was in a class all its own. This chart just spells it out perfectly. They're less like a planet and a moon, and more like 2 totally different worlds just dancing together in space. You've got Pluto, which is dense, with all these exotic frozen gases and a thin little atmosphere. And then you have Charon, a much lighter body made of good old water ice with no air at all. Then, get this, in 2005, right before the final verdict came down, the plot thickened yet again. The Hubble telescope spotted 2 more tiny moons, Nix and Hydra. So this wasn't just a planet with a weirdly huge moon anymore. It was a whole complex, miniature solar system of its own. And it wasn't just the moons. Pluto's path around the sun was a huge red flag. See, all the other planets orbit on a pretty flat plane, kind of like marbles on a dinner plate. But Pluto's orbit is tilted by a massive 17 degrees. It's so stretched out that for 20 years of its orbit, it's actually closer to the sun than Neptune is. No other planet does anything like that. So, the evidence file was getting pretty thick, right? We've got a giant moon, a bizarre orbit, a whole family of objects. But the final piece of evidence, the one that would just blow the case wide open, was still missing. And it wouldn't be found until the 1990s. All of Pluto's weirdness, its makeup, its strange orbit, its moons, it was all pretty hard to explain when we thought it was just this lone wanderer. But what if it wasn't alone? What if Pluto was just the very first one we happened to find? In 1992, the game completely changed. Astronomers started finding other objects way out there with Pluto. First one, then another, then hundreds, and pretty soon thousands. They had stumbled upon the Kuiper Belt, a gigantic, frozen version of the asteroid belt. And just like that, Pluto wasn't a weirdo anymore. It was simply the biggest kid on a very, very crowded block. And when I say crowded, I mean it. We now estimate there are over 100,000 objects out there bigger than 100 kilometers across, all sharing the same cosmic real estate as Pluto. And this right here was the smoking gun. Remember that third rule about having to clear your neighborhood? Well, Pluto couldn't possibly meet that standard. Its neighborhood isn't empty. It's one of the busiest places in the solar system, packed with countless other icy bodies. Pluto hadn't cleared its neighborhood. It was part of the neighborhood. So, with this final crucial piece of evidence in hand, let's go back to that courtroom in 2006. The decision to reclassify Pluto wasn't just some random thing. It was the logical conclusion of a 70-year investigation that completely flipped our understanding of the outer solar system on its head. So, was it a demotion? A lot of astronomers will tell you it was actually the opposite. Instead of being the ninth planet, kind of the tiny misfit at the end of the line, Pluto became the founding member of a whole new class of objects, the dwarf planets. It went from being the runt of one family to the undisputed king of another. But don't you think for a second that this case is closed? Plenty of planetary scientists argue that the IAU's definition itself is the real problem. Their take? If an object is big enough for gravity to pull it into a round shape, it's a planet, period. End of story. That debate is still raging today. And, throughout this entire debate, Pluto itself has slowly come into focus for us, from that tiny, blurry dot in 1930 to these amazing early maps from Hubble. Whether you call it a planet or a dwarf planet, that label doesn't change the fact that we now see it for what it is, a truly complex, dynamic, and fascinating world that is absolutely worthy of all this attention. And really, that's the big takeaway here. This whole argument over Pluto forced us to expand our vision. We learned that our solar system isn't just this neat little collection of 8 planets. It's a vast, diverse, and wonderfully messy place, filled with entire populations of worlds we never even knew existed. So maybe in losing a planet, we actually gained a universe.